Thanks very much for that generous introduction, and I enjoyed that last session. Some of it was fairly familiar. Some things have moved on, some things haven't. I was invited this afternoon just to give you a bit of a rundown on some of the activities of the ACCC, which Derek has summarised to some degree there. I think it's useful, rather than going into too much detail, I thought what I might do is just give you a bit of a summary of the range of activities related to agriculture within the ACCC, because I think my experience is that there's not a good awareness of that range of activities, and there's probably more that the agriculture sector could do to engage in some of the areas. I think it's fair to say that large companies involved in agribusiness or involved in the economy more generally are pretty familiar with the ACCC and its processes, and it's not as easy for small to medium businesses, which the multitude of a lot of farms are, to understand and engage with those processes. So I think it's useful just to spell them out. So the activities, I've summarised them under a few headings. The first one is market studies, and this is a new area for the ACCC in some respects. So that's where there's a very specific study done of a particular issue as it relates to competition. So in the agriculture sphere, there's been three essential market studies done over the last a bit over 12 months. One was the beef cattle market study that we carried out. We did a smaller one in horticulture as part of a review of the horticultural code, and we're currently fully involved in the dairy industry market study at the moment. The beef cattle study was quite interesting. I think the conclusions, if I'd summarise them, were that the industry works reasonably well, but has probably three areas where we felt there were some issues emerging. One was sale yards and how the sale yards operate, and particularly issues like commission buyers bidding on behalf of multiple clients and some of those sorts of activities. The grading issue was one that was brought up to us repeatedly. That's where, in selling over the hooks, producers were experiencing or concerned about the standard of grading they received and their ability to question that. And then market information was the third one, where the way that market information was structured, it was not easy to compare prices across different locations over the same timeframes. In relation to the sale yards, we've made a series of recommendations there. RMAC, the Red Meat Advisory Council, is looking at those, and so we're watching that with interest. In relation to grading, we're very strongly supportive of objective grading technology. Now, we didn't specify the technology, and I know that DEXA has subsequently emerged as the preferred option, but certainly we see that as a very good way to both improve competition and certainty around over the hooks trading, which amounts to about 90% of the slaughter cattle that are traded in Australia at the moment, and to get some transparency around that. On the market information side, I would have to say I'm happy to note that Meat and Livestock Australia adopted all the recommendations we made quite quickly. They had some of the process underway to do that. They adopted the rest of the recommendations, and I was advised the other day that the MyMLA website and market reporting and resource that's available online had been tested with a fairly large sample of producers and was endorsed by about 95% of them. So I know that MLA has acted very quickly on those issues, and the response they seem to have from those changes that they've made is certainly very positive. In the horticulture sector, I spent about a month going around all states holding forums with horticultural producers. We came back fully informed about some of the issues, a lot of the issues, in fact, that horticulture producers were concerned about, and then happened to stumble across a 1963 Royal Commission report into the Melbourne fresh produce markets, and realised then that we didn't need to write our report, that we could have just photocopied the original 1963 Royal Commission report, because the problems were exactly the same as the ones identified there. The Horticulture Code has subsequently been changed and updated and introduced on the 1st of April this year. We had a meeting with the Horticulture Group here earlier this week and went through in detail explaining what that code requires. And I take the point that a few of them made, that it won't necessarily solve all the problems, but I think it will go a fair way towards getting things a bit sorted out. I couldn't tell you the number of times producers approached us when we're doing our market study tour and told us about consignments of up to $500,000 that had been sent to agents or to merchants, and there was no paperwork. And our response to them repeatedly was, you haven't got any paperwork, you haven't got any agreement with that merchant or trader, you've sent off up to $500,000 worth of produce, you've now got a problem. It's very difficult for a regulator like the ACCC to do anything in that situation. So whilst I agree that the Horticulture Code now imposes paperwork requirements on the horticulture sector and trade through the fresh produce markets, I'd also have to observe, having been involved in the livestock industry for a considerable period of time, that the sort of paperwork that's proposed by the Horticulture Code really only comes part way towards the sort of paperwork that's involved routinely in livestock trading. So I think hopefully that will bring about some change in the fresh produce markets for the better and clarify the trading arrangements there. In the dairy, I don't know that I need to say much more. We were given fairly extensive powers by the Treasurer when that inquiry was announced in October last year. We've been around the country again. We've had hearings going on over the last month where we've had the executives of major dairy processors, major retailers appearing and giving evidence. We've had extensive documentation searches and extensive information collections, and I guess if nothing else, I think we will be very clear on where the margins are and who's making the money, and what has happened in the dairy industry over the last decade or so, and that'll give us a fairly solid ground to make some recommendations to government about what should happen in the future. So they've been some quite big areas. You'd also be aware that the ACCC's got market studies on in electricity and electricity pricing, and that's about to get underway. It's just completed a study on gas and gas pricing, and Northern Australian insurance is probably not an issue that's relevant here, but it does highlight the issue of availability and cost of insurance, particularly in regional areas, particularly in the north of Australia. In addition to those market studies, there's quite a deal of regulatory oversight in areas like water trading and the Wheat Ports Code. And so the ACCC both exercises regulatory authority over those areas, but also has a monitoring role. So some of you may have seen water trading and monitoring reports put out by the ACCC, and also Wheat Ports monitoring reports put out by the ACCC, which involves engaging with all participants and getting a good understanding of how port arrangements are working. So that's quite a heavy area of work as well. Telecommunications is another big area that the ACCC works in. Wholesale pricing of a whole range of services is part of the responsibility of the ACCC. And of course, we conducted and are still conducting an inquiry into the potential for mobile roaming service to address issues around competition in mobile telephone services. The draft report came out in relation to that report, and we're seeking still taking responses to it at the moment. As some of you would probably be aware, the Commission didn't recommend mandatory roaming, because of the concern that that might end up being the end of investment, particularly in regional Australia. But the very large questions still remain in that inquiry about how to improve telecommunications coverage in regional Australia, and that's certainly something that's vexing the minds of a lot of the people involved in that inquiry at the moment. Industry codes is another big area. The Food and Grocery Code, which Coles, Woolworths and Aldi have all signed up to. We've recently conducted the initial audit of compliance with that. So that is, we're actually starting to get to a point where those three major retailers have now got standard agreements with their suppliers that are documented and written down, and therefore reducing the amount of uncertainty associated with doing business with those organisations. So that's certainly a development that's improving. You'd probably also be aware there's been an ongoing debate about the sugar industry and marketing sugar, particularly in relation to the Burdekin region in Queensland, and that's resulted in a code, and again the ACCC has responsibility for that. So those areas are more general. Then the competition and consumer law is another area. So mergers are a very big part of the activity in that area. And three very interesting mergers that have been and are continuing to be part of that process are the Syngenta Chem China merger, the Dow DuPont merger, and the Bayer Monsanto merger. The ACCC has processes afoot with each of those. To some extent, they depend on developments occurring internationally. So the Department of Justice in the US and the EU Commission are very significantly involved in those, and there's a lot of information sharing between those agencies and the ACCC in relation to those three proposals. And I know, perhaps not in this room, but certainly throughout the agriculture sector more generally, there's been quite a deal of consultation by the ACCC with the industry around the potential implications of those. The Woolworths BP merger is another one where it's probably not as much relevant to regional Australia, but it does raise the issue of competition in petrol markets, which is a general one. The consumer law area is another area that's quite active. That's the area that covers things like unconscionable conduct and misleading and deceptive behaviour. That's the area that we're currently involved in litigation with Murray Goulburn over the dairy price drops a year and a half ago. And that's also the area of activity where a prosecution was successful against Coles for demanding extra payments from their suppliers that weren't part of the understanding of the agreement. It was less successful against Woolworths, but certainly sent a pretty strong message in combination with the Food and Grocery Code about how those organisations should behave. The other new area is the unfair contract terms law, which came in on the 11th of November last year. That's a law that says in relation to standard form contracts, where they're take it or leave it contracts, if they're between a large organisation and a small organisation, then they can't have what would be judged to be manifestly unfair terms. So the classic example is always a mobile phone agreement, which is a standard form agreement, which says on the one hand, if you discontinue, you have to pay out the full term of the contract, but reserves the right of the mobile phone company, for example, to vary the price whenever they feel like it. So basically the aim of that law is to make sure that in those sorts of contracts, so they're standard form, they involve big business and small business or consumers, those terms are fair. There's been quite a deal of activity, particularly in the grains industry, around those. Some of the contracts that were available in the grains industry, we've been engaging with the exporters and the bulk handlers in relation to that. And I must say there's been quite a good level of cooperation, and those organisations have actively moved to adjust those contracts to make sure they don't fall foul of that new law. So that's been quite an important area. Authorisations and collective bargaining is the other area, and there's a number of collective bargaining groups in this room and certainly some in the horticulture, the dairy and the poultry industry are involved in those. We're aware that they're not necessarily a panacea when it comes to negotiating between a collective group of farmers and a major processor. They're not compulsory for the processor to engage with, and so they can be quite frustrating, but there are some examples where they work quite well. The other area of authorisation is certified trademarks, and that's certainly becoming more and more important. So that's where people want to put a particular brand on their produce, be it pasture-fed, be it a particular breed or something like that. The authorisation involves registering a particular trademark, putting some rules around the use of that, and therefore being able to enforce that subsequently if someone decides to copy it for whatever reason. And the country of origin laws are the other change that's occurred in the last little while. The ACCC has responsibility for administering those. Then there's a whole range of what are referred to as enforcements and investigations. So where individuals come to the ACCC with a complaint about a particular situation, and we get about 250,000 complaints a year. They go through a triage process depending on the scale of significance, and quite a few of them, about 1,000 of them a year, end up going through an investigation. Of those, about 100 come to some sort of actual enforcement activity, be it the issue of an infringement notice, be it instigating court action, etc. So, and again, a lot of those, not in proportion terms, but in terms of numbers, a significant number of those involve agricultural matters. So I'd urge you all to be, to the extent that you can, a bit familiar with the ACCC and the role of the ACCC. It's really the prime agent that looks at competition in markets in agriculture and the economy more generally, and there are a lot of avenues there where groups, individuals and particular situations can be dealt with. So my encouragement to you all is don't all ring at once, but if you do have a problem, certainly make contact with the ACCC, because it's got a lot of people there who at the very first stage can give you advice, but secondly have the opportunity to take those matters further where there's a need to do that. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you, Matt and Derek.